The great chamber of Zenith Prime Station floated in the darkness between stars where no single species could claim advantage. Inside its crystalline walls, representatives from 12 different worlds gathered to discuss matters of galactic importance. Kyle Morrison sat in the human delegation seat, his dark suit a stark contrast to the colorful robes and natural armor of the alien ambassadors surrounding him. He had held this position for 8 years now, and in that time he had learned to read the subtle body language of species that had nothing in common with humanity except the desire to avoid war. The Vraxan ambassador coiled his serpentine body on the raised platform to Kyle's left. His scales caught the artificial light and threw back shimmers of green and gold. The Vraxan were ancient, their civilization spanning thousands of years, and they carried themselves with the pride of a species that had never been conquered. To Kyle's right sat the Keltari representative, her insectoid form clicking and chittering as she processed information through compound eyes that saw in spectrums humans could barely imagine. Between these two powers and a dozen others, humanity had found its place through careful words and patient negotiation. 300 years had passed since the first human ship had stumbled into Galactic Council space. The meeting had been tense, filled with uncertainty and fear on both sides. But humanity had extended open hands instead of weapons, had offered trade instead of conquest, and had slowly earned a seat at the table of civilized worlds. Now Earth maintained embassies on 40 planets, exchanged students with a dozen universities, and participated in scientific ventures that spanned the galaxy. It had been a good 3 centuries, peaceful and prosperous, exactly what humanity had hoped for when they first looked up at the stars and dreamed of what lay beyond. But lately, shadows had begun to creep across that bright future. The Kravik Empire had been expanding for 2 decades, swallowing smaller civilizations and pushing against established borders with increasing boldness. Their warlord Thraz ruled through fear and military might, and he had begun to turn his attention toward the outer rim, where human colonies had established themselves on agricultural worlds far from Earth's protection. At first it had been small incursions, scout ships probing defenses and testing response times. Then came the demands for tribute, for access to resources, for acknowledgement of Kravik supremacy. Kyle had spent the last 6 months trying to arrange mediation. He had filed formal protests with the Council, had requested sanctions against Kravik aggression, had even attempted direct negotiation with Thraz's representatives. Every effort had been met with delays, deflections, or outright mockery. The Council seemed reluctant to confront the Kravik directly, and the Kravik seemed to view human diplomatic efforts as proof of weakness rather than desire for peace. The Horizon glided through space on its way to yet another conference, its white hull marked with the blue and green emblem of United Earth. Commander Lisa Hayes stood on the bridge watching stars streak past in the view screen. She had commanded diplomatic vessels for 12 years, had carried ambassadors to 100 worlds, and had never once fired a weapon in anger. The Horizon was equipped with defensive shields and point defense systems, enough to protect against pirates or accidents, but it was not a warship. It was a symbol of humanity's commitment to peaceful exploration and cooperation. Jake Peterson sat at the communications station, his fingers dancing across holographic controls as he maintained contact with the colony worlds they passed. Each world reported the same story: Kravik ships in their space, Kravik demands growing bolder, Kravik soldiers landing on outlying settlements to claim supplies and territory. The colonists were afraid, but they trusted that Earth would find a diplomatic solution. They believed that the Council would step in, that reason would prevail, that war could be avoided through negotiation and compromise. Dr. Helen Carter reviewed the proposals in her quarters, her eyes scanning through hundreds of pages of carefully crafted agreements. She had spent weeks developing these documents, each one offering the Kravik something they claimed to want. Resource-sharing agreements that would give them access to minerals and agricultural products, cultural exchange programs that would help them integrate into the galactic community, territory adjustments that would address their expansion needs without requiring conquest. Every proposal was designed to give Thraz a way to back down without losing face, to turn aggression into cooperation, to transform an enemy into a neighbor. But Helen knew that all her careful work might be meaningless. She had studied the Kravik culture and history, had analyzed their patterns of behavior across 2 centuries of contact with other species. They respected strength and despised weakness. They valued direct action over subtle negotiation. And most troubling of all, they seemed to interpret humanity's endless patience as evidence that humans were incapable of defending themselves. The Council had made the same mistake. Over 300 years, humanity had declined every military alliance, had refused to participate in border conflicts, had chosen mediation over confrontation in every dispute. When the Zelnar Confederacy had requested human assistance in their war against the Dreth Collective, Earth had sent doctors and engineers instead of soldiers. When pirates raided shipping lanes, human vessels had upgraded their shields and hired escorts rather than form military patrols. When territorial disputes arose, humans had been the first to suggest compromise and the quickest to accept reduced claims. To species that had evolved in environments of constant competition and conflict, this behavior seemed inexplicable. The Vraxen had spent their early history conquering every other intelligent species on their world. The Kelthari had evolved from hive warriors that fought bitter wars over territory and resources. Even the more peaceful council members had military traditions stretching back millennia, because every civilization eventually faced threats that could not be negotiated away. Humanity's consistent choice of diplomacy over force seemed to suggest either remarkable wisdom or remarkable cowardice, and most council members had privately concluded it was the latter. Kyle had heard the whispers and seen the dismissive gestures. He knew that many ambassadors viewed humanity as useful, but ultimately unimportant, a minor power that would inevitably be absorbed by stronger neighbors. He had reported these attitudes back to Earth, had warned that humanity's reputation for peaceful behavior was being interpreted as inability rather than choice. But the response from Earth had always been the same: continue diplomatic efforts, avoid military confrontation, prove through patience and persistence that civilization could advance without violence. Now the Kravik had claimed 3 worlds in the Outer Rim, agricultural colonies where tens of thousands of humans had built lives far from Earth. The colonists had evacuated to underground shelters when the Kravik fleets arrived, had watched from below as alien soldiers planted flags and declared the planet's property of the Empire. No shots had been fired, no resistance offered. The Kravik had taken what they wanted, and humanity had protested through official channels, had filed complaints with the Council, had requested emergency sessions to address the violation of sovereign territory. Thraz had responded by announcing that humanity had 1 month to acknowledge Kravik authority over the occupied worlds or face further expansion into human space. He made these declarations publicly, broadcasting them across council networks where every species could hear humanity being threatened and humiliated. It was a test, Kyle realized, a challenge designed to force humanity to either fight or surrender. Thraz believed he had measured human capabilities and found them wanting. He thought he understood what humanity was capable of, thought he had identified a weak target that would yield territory and resources without significant resistance. The warlord had no idea how badly he had miscalculated. None of them did. The alarm started screaming at 3 a.m. station time when New Haven's orbital defenses detected incoming ships. Colony Administrator Derek Walsh had just enough time to initiate evacuation protocols before the first plasma barrage struck the northern continent. He watched through the command center's viewport as streaks of superheated energy tore through the atmosphere and turned fertile farmland into lakes of molten glass. The evacuation shelters were designed to withstand natural disasters and minor attacks, rated for protection against anything short of sustained orbital bombardment. Unfortunately, sustained orbital bombardment was exactly what Thraz had ordered. The Kravik fleet maintained firing solutions for 6 hours, systematically targeting population centers and infrastructure, while ignoring the desperate communication attempts from the surface. Derek managed to get most of the colonists into shelters before the bombardment reached the capital city, but the outer settlements had no warning and no chance. When the Kravik ships finally ceased fire and moved on to their next target, 40,000 people were dead, and New Haven's surface was scarred with craters that would glow with residual heat for months. News of the massacre reached Zenith Prime within hours. Kyle Morrison was reviewing trade agreements when his assistant burst into the office with a tablet showing preliminary casualty reports. He read through the list of confirmed dead with hands that refused to stay steady, scrolling past names of people he had never met until he found the ones that mattered. His sister Rachel had moved to New Haven 5 years ago with her husband and 2 children, seeking the quiet life of a frontier farmer far from Earth's crowded cities. Her name appeared on the casualty list along with her entire family. They had been in the southern agricultural zone when the bombardment began, too far from the shelters to reach safety in time. Kyle set down the tablet very carefully and walked to the council chamber without saying a word to anyone. His assistant tried to follow, but he waved her away, needing these few minutes alone to transform grief into something he could use. By the time he reached the great crystalline hall where ambassadors gathered, his face had settled into an expression of cold precision that made several delegates step back as he passed. The emergency session had already been called, and representatives were taking their positions, when Kyle climbed to the human delegation platform and requested immediate recognition to address the council. The Vraxon ambassador began to explain the procedural requirements for emergency declarations, but Kyle ignored him and activated the central holographic display without authorization. Images of New Haven appeared above the chamber floor, showing smoking craters where cities had stood and burned fields where crops had grown. The casualty numbers scrolled alongside footage recovered from satellites that had survived the attack. 40,000 dead, another 60,000 injured, 200,000 displaced from destroyed homes. Kyle let the images speak for themselves for a full minute before he began. His voice carried across the chamber with perfect clarity, each word measured and deliberate. He thanked the council for their months of patience and diplomatic efforts. He acknowledged that humanity had always preferred negotiation to confrontation, and had built its reputation on choosing peace whenever possible. He recognized that many species viewed human reluctance to engage in military action as a defining characteristic of Earth's civilization. Then he informed the assembled delegates that as of this moment, humanity's diplomatic approach to the Kravik situation had ended. The ultimatum was simple and non-negotiable. Thraz had 72 hours to withdraw all Kravik forces from human territory, return control of the 3 occupied colonies, and surrender himself for trial before the council on charges of war crimes and mass murder. If these conditions were not met within the specified time frame, Earth would respond with full military force and would continue operations until the Kravik Empire no longer posed a threat to human worlds or any other peaceful civilization. The chamber erupted into chaos. The Vraxon ambassador's scales flushed deep crimson as he demanded to know what military force Kyle was referring to. Since human defensive capabilities were well documented and consisted primarily of planetary shields and point defense systems, the Kelthari representative's clicking intensified to a frantic pitch as she calculated the probable outcome of human military vessels engaging Kravik warships. A dozen other delegates shouted questions or objections while Kyle stood silent on his platform, waiting for them to exhaust themselves. Thraz himself appeared via holographic transmission, his massive form dominating the center of the chamber as he laughed at humanity's threat. He called humans soft and weak, a species of farmers and merchants who hid behind diplomatic protocols because they lacked the strength to defend themselves. He suggested that perhaps he would take Earth itself as his next conquest, turning humanity's homeworld into a subject state that could serve the Empire's expansion. His words dripped with contempt and certainty, the absolute confidence of a warlord who had never faced real opposition. Kyle listened to the mockery without expression. When Thraz finished his speech and cut the transmission, Kyle activated his personal communicator and spoke a single phrase that was transmitted on secure channels back to Earth. Authorization granted. Then he gathered his materials, left the council chamber, and returned to the human embassy to begin making arrangements for his sister's memorial service. Captain Ryan Foster received the activation order while the Valiant was stationed in the Helix Nebula, one of 50 vessels hidden in deep space locations that no council survey had ever mapped. The ship had been his command for 7 years, 7 years of endless drills and simulations and maintenance checks, while waiting for orders that everyone hoped would never come. The Valiant was not a diplomatic vessel or a cargo hauler or a colony transport. It was a warship, built in secret orbital yards and equipped with weapon systems that incorporated 3 centuries of theoretical research into practical applications. Ryan had joined the United Earth Forces at 18, following a family tradition that stretched back before humanity had left their homeworld. His grandfather had served in the old national militaries before unification, had fought in conflicts that killed millions and nearly destroyed civilization. Those wars had taught humanity terrible lessons about the cost of violence and the importance of restraint. But they had also produced knowledge about tactics and strategy and organized warfare that could not be unlearned. Earth had chosen peace, but had never chosen to be unprepared. The crew moved through activation procedures with practiced efficiency. Engineer Carla Simmons brought the main reactor online, routing power to systems that had been in standby mode for years. Weapons Officer Greg Murphy initialized targeting computers and loaded combat algorithms that had been refined through millions of simulation hours. Navigation plotted routes to the rally point where 50 human warships would gather before proceeding to their target. Communications established encrypted links with Fleet Command and began receiving updated intelligence on Kravik positions and defensive capabilities. Throughout the ship and across the hidden fleet, men and women prepared for a mission they had trained for but never expected to execute. They were descendants of warriors and peacemakers both, carrying the dual legacy of a species that understood violence intimately and chose to avoid it whenever possible. They knew the history of human conflict, had studied the wars that nearly ended their civilization, and had volunteered to carry that burden so others could live in peace. Now someone had crossed the line that humanity had drawn, had killed innocents who could not defend themselves, and had mistaken restraint for weakness. The 72-hour countdown began. Across council space, diplomatic channels buzzed with speculation and debate. Most delegates believed humanity was bluffing, that Earth would eventually back down and seek another diplomatic solution. A few wondered if humans had hidden capabilities that might surprise the Kravik. None of them, not even Kyle Morrison's closest allies, understood the true scale of what was about to unfold. The Kravik had assumed humans feared war. They were about to learn that humanity remembered war far too well, and that memory made them the most dangerous opponent Thraz would ever face. The 72 hours expired with no response from Thraz, except another mocking broadcast, where he announced plans to occupy 2 more human colonies. Admiral Linda Shaw received confirmation of the warlord's refusal exactly 3 minutes after the deadline passed, and gave the order that 50 ship captains had been waiting to hear. The human fleet dropped out of slip space at the edge of the Kravik forward operating base with such perfect synchronization that their emergent signatures appeared on sensors as a single massive contact before resolving into individual vessels. The Kravik base commander had perhaps 30 seconds to process what his instruments were showing before the first human ships opened fire. Those 30 seconds must have felt like an eternity as he stared at sensor readings that made no sense, watching 50 warships appear where intelligence reports insisted no human military presence existed. His distress signal barely finished transmitting before the base's outer defensive platforms began exploding in sequence, each one targeted and destroyed by weapons that moved faster and hit harder than anything the Kravik had encountered before. Admiral Shaw stood on the bridge of the dreadnought Liberator and watched tactical displays update in real time as her fleet executed the attack plan. 3 centuries of theoretical warfare studies had produced combat doctrines that incorporated lessons from every major conflict in human history, refined through simulation and updated with technologies the Council had never imagined existed. The Liberator itself massed twice as much as the largest Kravik battleship and carried enough firepower to level a continent, but Shaw had no intention of using indiscriminate force. Her orders were explicit: disable or destroy every military installation and vessel, but accept surrenders and avoid civilian casualties wherever possible. The Kravik fought back with the brutal efficiency that had conquered 17 star systems. Their ships moved in tight formations, overlapping shields and concentrating fire on single targets while their fighters swarmed around larger vessels looking for weak points. It was a proven strategy that had overwhelmed dozens of species, but they had never faced an opponent quite like humanity. Other races had evolved on stable worlds where survival meant competing for resources or establishing dominance hierarchies. Humans had crawled out of an environment that demanded constant vigilance against predators and rivals alike, had spent 10,000 years turning survival instincts into organized violence, and had nearly destroyed themselves perfecting the art of war before finally learning when not to use it. Lieutenant Danny Warren piloted his fighter through a debris field that had been 3 Kravik frigates moments earlier, his hands moving across controls with reflexes inherited from ancestors who had tracked prey across ancient grasslands. His displays showed enemy positions, friendly locations, weapon status, and a dozen other variables that his brain processed and reacted to faster than conscious thought could follow. A Kravik interceptor lined up on his tail, and Danny rolled his fighter through an evasive pattern that ended with the enemy vessel in his sights instead, its shields collapsing under a burst from weapons that had been designed by engineers who understood both physics and psychology. On the Liberator, Weapons Officer Nicole Grant coordinated targeting solutions across the entire fleet, her displays showing a three-dimensional battlefield where human ships moved like dancers performing a choreographed routine. Every vessel knew exactly where every other vessel would be at any given moment, creating overlapping fields of fire that left no gaps in coverage and no safe zones for enemy ships. When a Kravik destroyer attempted to break through the formation and escape to hyperspace, 3 human frigates appeared in its path with weapons already charged and locked. The destroyer's captain chose surrender over destruction, and Nicole marked it as a prize vessel to be secured after the primary objectives were achieved. The Kravik base itself was a massive structure built around a captured asteroid, bristling with weapon emplacements and surrounded by defensive satellites. It served as the staging point for raids into human space and housed the supplies needed to maintain occupation forces on the 3 captured colonies. Admiral Shaw had allocated 12 ships specifically for neutralizing the base's defenses, while the rest of the fleet engaged mobile threats. The attack went exactly according to plan, with human vessels eliminating defensive positions in a sequence that collapsed the base's shield coverage, section by section, until the structure itself lay exposed and helpless. Thraz himself commanded the battle from his flagship, a massive dreadnought that served as both military headquarters and personal palace. He watched his defenses crumble with growing disbelief that slowly transformed into rage and then into fear. As he realized that humanity had not been weak at all, they had been patient, waiting and preparing while he mistook their diplomacy for cowardice. Now his forward base was destroyed, his fleet was in disarray, and human warships were converging on his position with obvious intent. Marine Sergeant Chris Baldwin led the boarding team that breached Thraz's flagship after the dreadnought's engines and weapons had been disabled by concentrated fire. His squad moved through corridors designed for beings twice their size, using combat tactics that had been developed through countless historical conflicts and refined for zero-gravity environments. The Kravik soldiers they encountered were fierce and determined, but they fought as individuals rather than coordinated units, and their weapons were designed for raw power rather than precision. Chris and his Marines had trained together for years, moving and fighting as a single organism that anticipated threats and adapted to changing conditions with practiced ease. They found Thraz in his command center, surrounded by guards who fought to the last rather than surrender their warlord. The battle was brief and brutal, ending when Chris put a stun round through Thraz's chest and watched the massive alien collapse. 2 Marines secured the warlord in restraints, while others swept the rest of the command center for threats and valuable intelligence. Within 20 minutes of the boarding action beginning, Thraz was in custody and being transferred to a human detention vessel equipped to hold dangerous prisoners. The entire battle lasted 6 hours from first contact to final surrender. The Kravik forward operating base was reduced to drifting wreckage. 47 enemy warships had been destroyed, and another 33 captured or disabled. Human casualties numbered 218 dead and 500 wounded, losses that Admiral Shaw mourned but recognized as remarkably light, given the scale of the engagement. The fleet had performed exactly as designed, proving that humanity's military capabilities were not theoretical exercises but practical applications of hard-won knowledge. The Galactic Council watched everything through sensor feeds and emergency transmissions, their various responses ranging from shock to horror to grudging respect. The Vraxan ambassador sat motionless in his coils, processing the reality that humanity had possessed this kind of power for centuries and never revealed it. The Kelthari representative transmitted urgent reports back to her homeworld, warning that their previous assessments of human capabilities had been catastrophically wrong. Other delegates simply stared at the displays in stunned silence, trying to reconcile 300 years of human diplomatic behavior with the overwhelming military force. They had just witnessed hidden shipyards that had been dismissed as civilian infrastructure were revealed as massive military-industrial complexes capable of producing warships that matched or exceeded anything the Council races possessed. Automated defense networks that had been cataloged as asteroid mining operations turned out to be weapon platforms positioned to protect human space from any direction. Research stations that supposedly studied stellar phenomena had actually been developing weapons and defensive technologies in secret, while humanity smiled and negotiated and carefully avoided any situation that would require showing their true capabilities. Kyle Morrison sat in the council chamber and watched ambassadors who had dismissed him for years suddenly regard him with new expressions, fear and respect mixed with anger at the deception, though several delegates seemed to understand why humanity had chosen to hide their strength. It was a lesson that Earth had learned through bitter experience, written in the ashes of cities destroyed by nuclear fire and the mass graves of genocides committed with industrial efficiency. A civilization that revealed its full power invited challenges from those who sought to test themselves against the strongest opponent. A civilization that appeared weak invited contempt and exploitation. Humanity had chosen a middle path, seeming peaceful while remaining prepared, hoping that wisdom and patience would make war unnecessary. That hope had died on New Haven along with 40,000 civilians who had trusted diplomacy to protect them. Now the galaxy would learn what humanity had always known, that peace was not weakness and restraint was not fear. The human fleet held position in neutral space, their weapons powered down but their presence unmistakable, while Admiral Shaw transmitted a message to every council world and every independent system within range. Humanity sought peace, desired cooperation, and wanted nothing more than to be good neighbors to all species willing to respect the rights of others. But aggression against human colonies or civilians would be met with the full force of Earth's military capabilities, and no amount of diplomatic discussion would save those who chose violence over coexistence. The message ended with footage of Thraz and restraints being loaded onto a prison transport, a warning and a promise both. The warlord who had mocked human weakness now served as proof that humanity remembered how to fight and would do so when necessary. The emergency council session convened 48 hours after the battle with every delegate present either physically or through holographic projection. The crystalline chamber felt different now, tension replacing the comfortable familiarity that had characterized 3 centuries of human participation in galactic affairs. Kyle Morrison entered through the main doors, but he did not walk alone this time. General Patricia Hayes accompanied him, her uniform displaying rank insignia and service medals that no council member had ever seen before, because her entire organization had been classified until 3 days ago. General Hayes was Supreme Commander of United Earth Forces, a position that officially did not exist according to every document humanity had filed with the Council over the past 300 years. She stood nearly 6 feet tall with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that had seen things most diplomats never imagined. Her presence in the council chamber represented a fundamental shift in how humanity would interact with the galaxy, a declaration that Earth would no longer pretend to be something it was not. The Vraxan ambassador struck the floor with his tail to call the session to order, the sharp crack echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. His scales had lost some of their usual luster, and his movements seemed less fluid than normal, as though the revelations of the past few days had physically affected him. He addressed Kyle directly, his voice carrying the authority of a species that had dominated council politics for millennia. The question was simple and pointed. How long had humanity been lying to the council about their military capabilities? Kyle remained standing while General Hayes took the seat beside him. He activated the central holographic display and began presenting classified records that Earth had maintained since first contact. Every diplomatic compromise appeared in chronological order with attached military assessments, showing what humanity could have done instead of negotiating. The territorial disputes where Earth had ceded valuable systems rather than fight for them, accompanied by tactical analyses proving human forces could have secured those regions easily. The trade agreements where humanity had accepted unfavorable terms to maintain peace, alongside economic projections showing Earth could have simply taken what they wanted through force. 300 years of choices scrolled past the assembled delegates, each one documented and analyzed. The pattern became undeniable as the presentation continued. Humanity had possessed overwhelming military superiority from the very beginning, but had chosen diplomacy over domination at every opportunity. They had built weapons capable of devastating entire fleets, and then hidden them away while pursuing peaceful cooperation. They had trained soldiers to fight wars across multiple environments, and then kept those forces in reserve while sending diplomats to resolve conflicts. Through words instead of violence, Counselor. Vrex of the Vraxon delegation rose from his coils with barely contained anger. His question came out as an accusation rather than an inquiry. If humans were so powerful from the start, why hide it? Why pretend to be weak when they could have demanded better terms, taken more territory, established themselves as a dominant force, rather than a minor player in council politics? Why spend 3 centuries acting like prey animals when they were actually apex predators? General Hayes stood to answer, and her voice filled the chamber with the kind of authority that came from decades of command experience. She asked the council to consider a hypothetical situation where humanity had arrived in their space 300 years ago, and immediately revealed their full military capabilities. Would the Council have welcomed them as partners or viewed them as threats? Would other species have sought cooperation or prepared for inevitable conflict? The General paused to let the question sink in before continuing with her explanation. Humanity had learned through bitter experience that strength alone did not create lasting peace. Earth's history was soaked in blood from conflicts that killed millions and nearly destroyed their entire civilization. They had developed weapons capable of ending all life on their planet, and had come within moments of using them multiple times. They had fought wars over resources, territory, ideology, and religion until finally understanding that military power without wisdom led only to mutual destruction. Dr. Martin Pierce stepped forward at the General's gesture, his role as Earth's chief military historian, giving him unique perspective on humanity's violent past. He began describing conflicts that most council members had never heard about, because humans rarely discussed their darkest chapters with alien species. World wars that consumed entire continents and killed populations numbering in the tens of millions. Nuclear exchanges that turned cities into radioactive wastelands. Genocides committed with industrial efficiency against civilian populations, whose only crime was being different from their attackers. The holographic display shifted to show images from Earth's history, carefully selected to illustrate the scale of human capacity for organized violence. Trenches filled with bodies from wars fought over kilometers of worthless mud. Cities reduced to rubble by bombing campaigns designed to break civilian morale. Concentration camps where millions died in systematic extermination programs. Nuclear detonations that vaporized hundreds of thousands in single blasts of hellfire, hot enough to fuse sand into glass. The council chamber fell completely silent as delegates processed what they were seeing. These were not ancient tribal conflicts or primitive skirmishes over hunting grounds. These were modern industrial wars fought with technology and logistics and strategic planning. Conflicts that had refined the science of killing to levels most species never imagined possible. Humanity had not evolved in an environment of constant warfare like some races, but they had created one through their own actions and spent thousands of years perfecting methods of destroying each other. Dr. Pierce explained that Earth's unification had not come from enlightenment or natural evolution toward peace. It had come from exhaustion and terror after humanity finally developed weapons powerful enough to end their entire species. Nuclear arsenals capable of rendering the planet uninhabitable had forced cooperation because the alternative was extinction. Nations that had been enemies for centuries learned to negotiate because continuing their conflicts meant dying together in atomic fire. That lesson had shaped everything about how humanity approached the galaxy after achieving space travel. They knew that revealing their full military capabilities would start an arms race or provoke preemptive attacks from species who feared being conquered. They knew that appearing too weak would invite exploitation from aggressive empires. So they had chosen a careful middle path, seeming peaceful while maintaining hidden strength, hoping that patience and diplomacy would make war unnecessary. The Keltari representative spoke for the first time since the session began, her translator converting clicking sounds into words that everyone could understand. She asked the question that others were thinking but hesitant to voice. Would humanity now use their revealed strength to expand their own territory, to establish an empire, to become the very thing they claimed to oppose? After all, they had shown themselves capable of deception on a massive scale and willing to use overwhelming force when their interests were threatened. It was Susan Reed who answered, still wearing her flight suit with scorch marks from the recent battle. She had piloted a fighter through the engagement that destroyed the Kravik base, had watched friends die when their ships were destroyed, and had helped secure the victory that brought Thraz into custody. She explained that humanity did not want an empire because they remembered what empires cost to maintain. The surveillance required to control subject populations, the military forces needed to suppress rebellions, the endless cycle of violence that came from ruling through fear rather than cooperation. Susan described what her great-grandfather had told her about the old national empires on Earth, how they had conquered and controlled vast territories while draining resources and lives from both the conquered and the conquerors. Those empires had eventually collapsed under their own weight, leaving behind resentment and instability that sparked new conflicts. Humanity had learned that domination created enemies while partnership created allies, and they would much rather have neighbors than subjects. General Hayes concluded the presentation by outlining Earth's actual objectives going forward. They would maintain transparency about military capabilities and expect the same from other council members. They would participate in mutual defense agreements and support efforts to prevent aggressive expansion by any species. They would offer aid in rebuilding the Kravik territories and helping displaced populations return to peaceful governance. But they would never again allow anyone to mistake human restraint for weakness or assume that diplomacy meant inability to defend their people. The council session continued for another 6 hours as delegates asked questions, demanded clarifications, and processed the fundamental shift in galactic power dynamics. Some ambassadors expressed anger at being deceived for 3 centuries, while others admitted they understood why humanity had chosen secrecy. A few species immediately proposed military alliances, while others withdrew to reassess their own security situations. The Vraxan ambassador sat in silence for most of the session, his earlier arrogance replaced by calculation, as he recognized that his species' dominant position in the council had just been challenged. Kyle Morrison watched it all unfold with mixed emotions. He had spent 8 years building relationships with these delegates, earning trust through patient diplomacy and careful negotiation. Now those relationships would have to be rebuilt on a foundation of truth, rather than carefully maintained deception. Some friendships might survive the revelation while others would be permanently damaged. But honesty seemed preferable to continuing the charade, especially after New Haven had proven that hiding human capabilities did not actually prevent violence. When the session finally adjourned, General Hayes departed immediately to oversee military operations, while Kyle remained behind to handle the diplomatic aftermath. Several ambassadors approached him privately to express grudging respect for humanity's patience, and others to warn that revealing such power had made Earth a target for species who felt threatened. Kyle accepted both the praise and the warnings with equal composure, knowing that humanity had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed and would have to navigate whatever consequences followed. The Kravik Empire began crumbling within weeks of Thraz's capture as subject worlds realized that the warlord's invincibility had been an illusion. Colonies that had been conquered decades ago rose in rebellion, while others simply declared independence and dared the remaining Kravik military to do something about it. Without their leaders' brutal charisma, and with their forward base destroyed, the Empire's expansion ground to a halt, and then reversed as occupied territories slipped away one by one. Humanity offered aid to any world seeking independence from Kravik rule. Sending engineers to rebuild damaged infrastructure and medical teams to treat populations that had suffered under occupation. Captain Ryan Foster found his warship repurposed for peacekeeping operations. The Valiant's weapon systems powered down, while its cargo holds filled with construction equipment and humanitarian supplies. He worked alongside former enemies who had fought against human forces just months earlier, proving that Earth's commitment to peace was genuine even after demonstrating their capacity for war. The Council restructured itself over the following year as member species adjusted to the new reality of galactic politics. Ambassador Kyle Morrison spent countless hours in negotiations that established protocols for military transparency and mutual verification. No longer would civilizations hide their true capabilities while pretending to be something they were not. Instead, each species would maintain open records of military forces and allow periodic inspections to ensure that no one was secretly preparing for conquest. The Vraxan ambassador initially resisted these changes, arguing that his civilization's long history of dominance gave them special status within the council. But his protests lost force when other delegates pointed out that Vraxan military superiority had been more assumed than real, and that several species, including humanity, could now field forces that matched or exceeded anything the reptilian empire possessed. The ambassador eventually accepted the new framework with as much grace as he could manage, recognizing that clinging to the old order would only isolate his people. The Kelthari representative became one of humanity's strongest advocates for the new transparency protocols. Her species had evolved from hive warriors and understood the value of knowing exactly what threats existed, rather than guessing in the dark. She worked closely with Kyle to develop inspection procedures that protected legitimate security concerns, while preventing the kind of deception that humanity had practiced for 3 centuries. The irony of humans helping to create rules against secrecy was not lost on anyone, but the Kelthari diplomat argued that Earth's experience made them uniquely qualified to prevent others from making similar choices. Engineer Carla Simmons spent 6 months on a joint technology exchange program where human and alien scientists shared knowledge that had been classified for generations. She discovered that several council species had developed innovations that Earth had never considered, while humans had made breakthroughs in fields that others had barely explored. The resulting collaboration produced advances in shield technology, propulsion systems, and medical treatments that benefited every participating civilization. What had been hidden for fear of military advantage became shared progress toward common goals. Thraz himself stood trial before the council on charges that included war crimes, mass murder, and crimes against sentient beings. The proceedings lasted 3 months as prosecutors presented evidence of atrocities committed across 17 conquered systems. The warlord showed no remorse and claimed that strength gave him the right to take what he wanted from weaker species. His conviction was unanimous and his sentence was life imprisonment in a maximum security facility designed to hold the galaxy's most dangerous criminals. The 3 colonies that Kravik forces had occupied were returned to human control along with reparations paid from the Empire's seized assets. New Haven began the long process of rebuilding, its survivors returning from evacuation shelters to find their world scarred, but not destroyed. The memorial to the 40,000 dead became a gathering place where humans and aliens both came to reflect on the cost of assuming that peaceful behavior meant inability to defend oneself. Commander Lisa Hayes returned to diplomatic missions aboard the Horizon, but the vessel no longer traveled alone. 2 human frigates accompanied every diplomatic ship, their presence serving as both protection and reminder that Earth's peaceful intentions were backed by the capacity for violence if necessary. The arrangement seemed to make negotiations smoother rather than more difficult, as potential troublemakers recognized that threatening human diplomats would have immediate and unpleasant consequences. Lieutenant Danny Warren transitioned from combat pilot to instructor, teaching young officers from multiple species about fighter tactics and combat doctrine. His classes included students from former council rivals who had dismissed human capabilities just a year earlier. He found that most species had much to learn about coordinated warfare because their evolutionary backgrounds had not prepared them for the kind of organized violence that humans had refined over millennia of practice. Dr. Helen Carter finally got to implement some of her diplomatic proposals as the Kravik territories reorganized into independent systems that needed help establishing stable governments. Her expertise in conflict resolution and cultural exchange proved invaluable, as former subject populations learned to govern themselves without the unifying fear of a conquering warlord. Several worlds requested human advisors to help develop their own defensive capabilities while avoiding the imperial ambitions that had characterized their previous rulers. The galaxy settled into a new equilibrium, where power was more evenly distributed and honestly acknowledged. Trade increased as species that had been wary of each other found common ground through shared understanding of mutual capabilities. Scientific cooperation expanded as civilizations recognized that working together produced better results than competing in isolation. Military alliances formed based on genuine mutual interest rather than assumptions about who was strong and who was weak. Kyle Morrison stood before the council 2 years after New Haven's destruction and reflected on how much had changed. His sister and her family remained dead, their loss a permanent wound that time would never fully heal. But their deaths had forced humanity to reveal itself honestly to the galaxy, and that revelation had created opportunities for genuine cooperation that polite deception had never achieved. The Council now functioned as a partnership of equals rather than a hierarchy of assumed superiority, and that shift had made the entire region more stable. General Hayes visited Zenith Prime for annual military reviews, where human forces demonstrated their capabilities alongside armies from other species. The displays were not shows of dominance, but rather honest assessments of what each civilization could contribute to mutual defense. Former competitors found themselves working together on joint training exercises and combined fleet operations. The general noticed that several species had begun adopting human tactical doctrines, while humans learned from alien innovations in shield harmonics and energy weapon design. Jake Peterson continued his work as communications officer, now coordinating between human vessels and allied ships from a dozen different species. The networks that had once carried only diplomatic messages now handled military coordination, scientific data sharing, and cultural exchange programs. He found that honest communication produced better results than carefully worded statements designed to hide uncomfortable truths. The young pilot Susan Reed received a commendation for her actions during the battle against the Kravik base and used her newfound visibility to advocate for veterans programs that helped soldiers transition back to civilian life. She spoke publicly about the psychological cost of combat and the importance of supporting those who fought to protect others. Her honesty about the difficulties of warfare resonated across species lines because violence took similar tolls regardless of whether the combatant was human or alien. At the New Haven Memorial, fresh flowers appeared every day as visitors from across the galaxy paid their respects to the civilians whose deaths had changed everything. The inscription remained simple and profound, a reminder written in every council language that peace required both the wisdom to avoid violence and the strength to resist aggression. The 40,000 dead had not died in vain because their sacrifice had forced humanity to step out of comfortable shadows and reveal themselves honestly to neighbors who needed to understand that restraint was a choice rather than a limitation. The Galactic Council had assumed humans feared war because they consistently chose peace over conflict. That assumption had been understandable, but wrong in ways that nearly cost humanity everything. Earth did fear war, but not because they lacked the capacity to wage it. They feared war because they understood it intimately, had studied its methods and costs across thousands of years, and knew that victory often destroyed the victors as thoroughly as the defeated. Now the galaxy understood that a species which truly comprehended the price of violence made both the most dangerous enemy and the most valuable ally. Humanity would talk first, negotiate second, and fight only when all other options had been exhausted. But when forced to fight, they would do so with the full weight of their terrible knowledge, bringing to bear every lesson learned from millennia of organized warfare, refined through centuries of peaceful preparation. The Council would never again mistake human intentions or capabilities. Peace was not weakness, restraint was not fear, and diplomacy was not inability. Humanity had proven all of this through actions that spoke louder than any words could convey. The galaxy had learned its lesson, and in learning had found partners rather than prey, allies rather.